Well, as the rail blockades continue, the uncertainty grows for many Canadian industries and their supply chains that rely on the rails for domestic distribution and for export. Grocery chains are starting to see shortages of perishable goods. Large retailers have goods stuck in port or stranded on ships offshore. And Canadian farmers have begun rationing propane and feed in case the rail shutdown does drag on. And soon, that pain and concern, hey, that could be felt by Canadian consumers as well. And farmers say they want decisive action from the federal government to deal with this situation. What action and how bad is the situation for farmers? Let's find out. Mary Robinson is the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. She's a Prince Edward Island potato farmer. And Keith Currie is the vice president of the CFA and a hay and sweet corn farmer from Collingwood, Ontario. They represent some 200,000 farm families in this country, and they're with me in the studio, as you can see. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here. First of all, tell me how these blockades are affecting your members, these 200,000 farm families in Canada. What's actually happening on the ground out there?
The impact is far-reaching for us. We have producers in the West who rely on rail to get grains to port, and without being able to get grain to port, it means that we've got 50 vessels sitting in port in Vancouver waiting, and the meter is running, so that means there's additional costs that will be passed to farmers in that situation, tens of thousands of dollars a day per vessel. So we know our grain growers have told us that they're seeing losses of $9 million a day just for primary producers. And we're also seeing, as far as propane to heat barns, poultry cannot survive in a barn unless the barn is heated. And in Quebec, 85% of all chicken barns are heated by propane, and 80% of their propane is moved by rail. So we have, a looming animal welfare situation. And in the East Coast, we also have feed that can't get to livestock. We have, right now, we'd be normally putting different components in place for planting in spring, which would be seed potatoes from Western Canada that travel to Eastern Canada, as well as fertilizer and all kinds of components that we would normally be putting in place now.
Keith, tell me more about that. I'm not sure everybody connects those dots when we talk about, the connection between ships sitting in port waiting and what does that have to do with a cost to a farmer? Walk me through some of that.
Well, ultimately, when this all gets resolved, somebody's going to have to pay that bill. And it's not going to be the end user, it's not going to be the end buyer, the consumer. There might be a little bit additional cost to the consumer, but ultimately that cost is going to be borne by the producer, the farmer. And that's true in a lot of products. Not only are grains not getting out to the West Coast, we have lots of products in Eastern Canada that aren't getting to processed markets or packaging markets. We have a bunch of perishable products like apples sitting on rail cars right now that can't get to a packer. Are they going to spoil? Are they going to lose that market because they can't get to a packing plant? A lot of our pork is shipped by rail to either to the processor or from the processor. We're losing those markets. So there's an economic loss to the farmer, but also any extra costs are going to be borne by the farmer as well.
That's really important, I think, to drill down a bit further, Mary. This notion that I think for a lot of Canadians, if there's some kind of a dispute or a stoppage or a rail strike, when stuff does start getting move again, people think, well, it doesn't matter. They'll recoup their losses and just pass on that cost to consumers. So consumers will pay more, and that could well be the case eventually when we move through this conflict. But that doesn't mean the farmer gets a piece of that, right?
No, this has a definite impact on our net bottom line. We don't have the ability to pass any of these costs on to anyone else. We're the foundation for Canadian agriculture, and when we sell on market, we sell at market prices. So much like how you would buy an ounce of gold, that price is set, and you don't have any opportunity, if you're selling that gold, to command a different price than your neighbor does. So when you're selling grain on a market, that price is set by the market, and that's the price you get.
When you want decisive action from the federal government, what are we talking about? What do you want to see?
Well, on this issue, we need some leadership and we need it to be resolved. We need to get back to business. It would be great if this conversation was, the situation was de-escalated and there be meaningful dialogue and resolution, where we certainly would like to see a long-term resolution to this situation so we don't continue to see it crop up. And moving forward, what we need to see from federal government is more confidence and more investment in Canadian agriculture to help us really achieve the potential that we know we have.
So as we speak, what we're seeing is a federal government, Keith, that's saying, and the Prime Minister is saying, look, they're essentially relying on negotiation, and they're calling for blockades to come down, injunctions to be enforced. What more should they be doing? When you talk decisive action, what could that be?
Well, I think they have to actually force the conversation to happen, first of all. Asking for resolve in this without actually taking the steps to make those conversations happen isn't going to solve the situation.
But they say the overtures there for the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. They're waiting for meetings, waiting for face-to-face conversations. You want them to do what? Push?
I want them to jump in the car and go see them. I want that action to happen now, so at least we have that conversation, so they know what the parameters are around resolving this situation. We've talked briefly about the short-term ramifications, but there are long-term ramifications on our markets overseas and around the world that we export to, because in agriculture we're an export country, and if we
you think the world's looking at this and saying Canada's no longer a reliable
we want
supplier.
Constant, stable markets that we can rely on shipping products to us, and if Canada can't effectively get us that with confidence, then we'll look elsewhere to find it. And that's the danger we have long term in this. So that's why there's an urgency to find resolve in this situation.
How urgent is it? I mean, we touched on the notion of shortages of propane and feed and so on. How critical? How many days are we talking here before it really starts to get felt in the farm families?
Yeah,
and it is now to some extent.
It is definitely impacting farm families right now, and I guess if someone was told that in 7 to 10 days they might not be able to heat their home, then at what point does it become a crisis for them? It's something they're certainly going to put as a high priority right now. And we do know in Quebec that we were told they do have 7 to 10 days of propane reserves now to continue to heat barns. So we are certainly at a turning point right now, a tipping point. And when we look at the days we're losing on rail, and we know that there's going to be a backlog of other business that needs to move on rail, we're getting into a point where spring planting is going to be threatened here, because how long will it take for us to catch up and get product where it needs to go?
What about the notion of, jumping ahead a bit here, the notion of compensation? I mean, we talked a little bit about losses. Have you had any conversations with federal officials, Minister of Agriculture, for instance, about, okay, what can you do for farmers when this gets settled?
Certainly we're going to be thinking about that in the future. Right now our focus is predominantly on getting back to business. We've got to get the rails moving again, and then we can deal with the issue of compensation after the fact.
Some people will hear this and say, okay, so you can't move this by rail. What about moving it by transport truck?
Before we started this blockade situation, our trucking sector was overwhelmed, and it did not have the resources to meet demand. In Eastern Canada, we're constantly struggling to find trucks to move product because we don't have as robust a rail service in Eastern Canada as Central and Western Canada.
What are you seeing? Same challenges in Ontario?
Yeah, in particular with propane, the bulk of it is moved from Sarnia into Eastern Canada to the suppliers, and then from there it's by truck. So we just don't physically have the truck infrastructure, even if we had lots of available drivers, to find those trucks to move the propane, to adequately supply everybody. And you know, we're talking now not just about the farm impact, we're talking about rural Canada impact, nursing homes, hospitals, rural homes that are heated by propane. We're talking about medical supplies in remote northern areas, those kinds of things, so it's impactful.
Let me finish on this. There's been a lot of conversation in this country in the last number of years about the challenges for farmers in this country and issues around mental health. And so it's been a tough year. I mean, you've had a rail strike in the fall. You've had the battles with the Chinese over some of our exports, and now you've got this.
And weather.
And weather. Talk to me a bit about that, about supports for farm families and how this is layered on top of those challenges and this concern around mental illness.
So the Canadian Federation of Agriculture is actively working on this file in particular, and we do have different services available in different provinces. For example, in my home province, Prince Edward Island, we have an exceptional program called the Farmers Assistance Program, which is funded in part by our provincial government. The mental health situation is absolutely dire, and what we'd like to do is beef those offerings up for producers across the country. We're always encouraging our members to check in on their neighbors. You know, something as simple as that can go a long way. Make sure that people are doing all right, and if you haven't seen someone around, touch base with them. But I know the impact of suicide is certainly something we're all too familiar with.
All right, and another level of stress for farmers in this country right now until this gets settled. Mayor Robinson, Keith Currie, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Peter.